I'm Robert Guadarrama. Here is your Spectrum News in 90. Lies and stumbles. The two big takeaways from the first debate from President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. 81-year-old Biden had several moments where his age showed against his 78-year-old rival. Some Democrats are voicing concern about Biden's future on the ticket. Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries is continuing to back the president. Biden and Donald Trump repeated multiple false claims during the debate. Trump claimed Democrats were, quote, killing babies after birth in a response to a question on the legality of abortions. President Biden was fact-checked about touting the wrong unemployment numbers, saying it was 15% when he took office, when actually it was just 6.4%. The Supreme Court today ruled in favor of limiting the prosecution of January 6 rioters. The 6-3 decision found the Justice Department overstepped by charging hundreds of Donald Trump supporters who attacked the Capitol. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion. The court today also curbed the power of the federal government by overturning the Chevron doctrine. The 1984 standing empowered federal agencies to take action. The decision is another 6-3 ruling, could have sweeping implications for the environment, public health, and the workplace. Now, a check of your forecast.
Hot weather continues to be the issue as we get going in towards the weekend. We're looking at some storms in the upper Midwest. But again, along with that, there's some very hot weather, and that's fuel, and that will be, causing some severe weather. We'll be keeping an eye on that. Still some hot weather in the southwest. Things have quieted down in the northeast, and just your average hit or miss showers across Florida as we get through another warm, muggy afternoon.
With the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare.
Debate debacle. President Joe Biden's performance last night has some Democrats worried as former President Donald Trump continuously touted lies. Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Robert Guadarrama. You're watching Spectrum News. Biden's numerous flubs opened the floodgates to more concerns about his age and fitness. As for Trump, he did not fully commit to accepting the election results and failed to address his new campaign pledge on deporting people living in the U.S. without documentation. The candidates are now back on the road campaigning this afternoon. Today, Biden is in Raleigh, North Carolina. Trump is in Chesapeake, Virginia. National political reporter Taylor Popolars leads us off today. Taylor, you covered the debate last night, hopped on a flight, and are back in the nation's capital. I think you said only 3 hours of sleep. Well, thank you for your hard work. Let's talk about this debate because it was 90 minutes of attacks, stumbles, and falsehoods in Atlanta. What stood out most to you?
Yeah, it really wasn't encouraging, especially for voters who maybe haven't been following this presidential race closely and were just tuning in for the first time. I think obviously the top line was President Biden's performance. You know, his team pitched this debate happening this early in the summer, happening in a studio with no live audience, happening with muted microphones, and the Trump campaign agreed to all of that. And the Biden campaign's thinking was that would help set up this contrast, and instead, Biden seemed to have a really poor performance, as you mentioned, where he was stumbling, where he was not making sense at certain points, and really put into question whether or not, as an 81-year-old, he could serve another 4 years if he can't get through a 90-minute debate. I think for the Trump campaign, as I said earlier today on a radio show I was on, Trump didn't necessarily make any news because if you listen to his rallies or speeches or interviews that he gives, he pretty much went through all his typical talking points. There were a lot of falsehoods. There were a lot of exaggerations. He also declined to commit to accepting the election results multiple times over the course of the debate. So not necessarily a great performance for him, but pretty much less news than Biden, who his own members of his party are kind of freaking out about it right now.
Right. And Taylor, let's talk about those falsehoods because both candidates repeated false claims last night, and there was no live fact-checking by the moderators. Let's talk about some of them first from Donald Trump. He repeated a frequent falsehood that Democrats kill babies after birth. Let's listen.
So that means he can take the life of the baby in the 9th month and even after birth, because some states, Democrat run, take it after birth. Again, the former governor of Virginia, put the baby down, then we decide what to do with it.
All right, Taylor, fact check this for us because that is not the case.
Yeah, that is not the case. It's actually illegal in all 50 states. I'm just looking at some notes that we have assembled. It's called infanticide. And the reality is for late-term abortions, it's just a small percentage of them happen after 21 weeks or later in a pregnancy. So that's just not true.
Now, President Biden also had some false claims, not nearly as many as the former president. One claiming unemployment was at 15% when he took office. We know that is not true.
Yeah, it's not. What he was conflating was the height of unemployment during the pandemic in 2020 while Trump was still in office. It did at one point reach, I think it was 15 or 20%. But in January 2021, when Biden assumed the presidency, the unemployment rate was 6.4%. That's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics data. So obviously the economy was in rough shape and was still coming out of the pandemic. But Biden did not inherit it at its worst like it was in early 2020 when we were all in lockdown and just trying to process what was going on with COVID.
All right, our resident fact checker, Taylor Popolars in Washington. Taylor, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert.
Let's bring in Spectrum political anchor Tim Boyum to the conversation. Tim, it was not the night the Biden campaign needed, but it was also a weak night for Trump factually, as we saw a continuation of lies from the former president and essentially, Tim, a non-answer to whether or not he would accept the results of the upcoming election. I have to ask, what is your overall takeaway from last night?
Yeah, I don't think there's any way you can put aside that it was a bad night for the president and Joe Biden. That moment where he said, you know, we beat Medicare and sort of stumbled and whatnot was the clear moment that most Americans, I think, took away from that debate last night. And it was the last thing, as you mentioned, that this campaign needs. He's actually in North Carolina today. And I think they're, you know, outside of issues, they're really going to have to push forward with this energy and put out a blitz out there that he can maintain himself on the campaign trail to get past that, because this really does feel like there was an imprint on the American people about the question about the age of President Biden. On the other side, as you mentioned, there were a lot of issues there with President Trump and, you know, misstatements and lies. But the truth is people are used to that. So that was nothing new to the American people. So it didn't stand out to them anymore, almost desensitized to it, for better or for worse. So it was definitely a better night for Donald Trump. It may not have been a good night for the American people overall either.
Right. Tim, let's talk about the flood of reaction to the debate. Social media is on fire. I've seen that flub, that clip of that flub you mentioned early on in the debate, all over social media. Immediately after the debate, Vice President Kamala Harris went on a media blitz defending Biden. Take a listen.
Yes, there was a slow start, but it was a strong finish. And what became very clear through the course of the night is that Joe Biden is fighting on behalf of the American people, on substance, on policy, on performance. Joe Biden is extraordinarily strong, and that cannot be debated.
Even there, the VP saying it was not a perfect debate. So, Tim, some Democrats have called for Biden to step aside. What would that even look like? And would that help or hurt Democrats' chances of retaining the presidency, especially this late into the election?
Well, that's the key point, too. And by the way, you know, the statements of it was a slow start, this is an acknowledgement that it was a bad night. And that is a rare thing in politics, that you see something like that,
right,
that there's just an outright acknowledgement that it was a bad night. It is a very difficult time at this point to try to put somebody else on the ballot, because I don't know who could come in outside of someone like Michelle Obama or Oprah Winfrey that most of the country knows and that might not question trying to go up against Donald Trump. And so I don't know that the process, I'm assuming a brokered convention at this point would be the most likely avenue if that was to occur. But it is late in the process, and I'm not so sure there's someone that could just jump in and go toe-to-toe right away with President Trump. But we'll see. There are some Democrats that are questioning it today, no question.
Right. Time will tell. All right, Tim Boyum, thank you as always.
Yeah, good to see you.
We're also following big news from the Supreme Court today, how the justices ruled on a charge against the January 6 rioters and what it could mean for President Trump. Just ahead on Spectrum News.